The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as Katie Rodriguez stepped through the automatic doors of Seattle General's emergency department in San Antonio, 6:44 a.m., her scrub still carrying the faint smell of the laundry detergent from home. The ER sprawled before her like a controlled disaster, monitors beeping in a discordant rhythm, gurneys lined along the hallway, the peculiar alchemy of antiseptic and human suffering that never quite smelled like anything else. She'd smelled worse. She'd smelled blood and cordite and burning rubber in Tikrit, smelled it on her own uniform when the dust settled and the screaming stopped. This was manageable. This was civilian. This was supposed to be safe. She moved through the nurses' station with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd triaged gunshot wounds in a field tent with nothing but gauze and morphine and the certainty that someone was going to die on her watch. Her hands were steady as she began prepping for trays, laying out supplies in precise rows, 18-gauge needles, 20-gauge, 22-gauge, each in its place like ammunition in a bandolier. The nurses around her glanced up briefly, offered tight smiles, then looked away. Day 5 on the job and they still hadn't figured out if she was competent or if she was the kind of new hire who would slow them down. Katie preferred it that way. Invisible was survivable. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for a roll of tape, aftermath of a mortar concussion, the kind of thing her physical therapist said would improve with time and stress reduction. Katie had not mentioned that her job for the last 4 months involved pretending to be someone she wasn't in a place where one mistake could burn a federal investigation worth millions of dollars. Stress reduction seemed unlikely. The other nurses noticed the tremor. She watched their eyes flick down, their expression soften with what they thought was sympathy. Poor thing must be nervous. New to the hospital. Probably worked in a smaller clinic somewhere. They had no idea that the tremor came from a blast that had killed 2 of her soldiers, that her hands had held their names while waiting for the medevac, that her hand still remembered exactly how much pressure it took to perform a needle decompression for a tension pneumothorax while lying flat in the dirt with sniper rounds hammering the building behind her. Katie touched the small bundle in her locker, a folded flag from her fallen teammate, Marcus Chen, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse. She'd carried it since the funeral, hadn't been able to leave it at home even though it violated every protocol, every bit of operational security she'd been trained to maintain. She pressed it between her palms for exactly 3 seconds, the way she'd done before every shift for the past 18 months, and let it anchor her. This was why she was here. Not for the hospital. Not for the cover story. For the fact that someone was profiting from cutting corners on equipment, from falsifying end-of-life care billing, from running a fraud scheme that would make any cartel kingpin jealous. Marcus had died for real. These victims deserved better than becoming line items in a ledger. The elevator doors opened at the north end of the nurses' station, and Dr. Pierce stepped out with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, maybe 190 pounds, with the kind of face that had never doubted itself, ever. Expensive shoes. Katie could always spot the expensive shoes first. Cole Haan Oxfords, probably $400, probably never worn anywhere that mattered. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, the kind that announced he'd made serious money and intended to keep making it. He scanned the ER with the clinical precision of a predator counting prey, and when his eyes landed on her, Katie felt the crosshairs settle directly on her spine. She didn't look up. Deferential was survivable. Invisible was survivable. Anything else invited scrutiny she couldn't afford. Pierce moved through the station like he owned it, and based on the way the other nurses straightened in his presence, the way their voices pitched lower, maybe he did. He stopped at the central monitor bank, checking patient admissions with the disinterested focus of someone reviewing an inventory spreadsheet. Katie kept her head down, kept her hands moving. She was reaching for another roll of tape when she heard his voice for the first time in person. Rodriguez. Not a question. A summons. Katie turned. Eye contact was required now, expected. She made herself meet his gaze, let her face settle into the expression of a junior nurse facing a senior physician. Respectful. Slightly uncertain. Exactly what he expected to see. Yes, Dr. Pierce. How long have you been at Seattle General? 5 days, sir. He studied her with the intensity of someone reading a medical chart, and Katie understood in that moment that he was doing exactly that, reading her like data, categorizing her, filing her away in whatever mental system he used to sort the people in his department into useful and disposable. His eyes lingered on her hands for a fraction of a second longer than was comfortable. Katie forced herself not to close them, not to hide the faint white lines that crisscrossed her knuckles from glass extraction during a house fire in Tikrit. Shrapnel wounds. She'd told the hiring committee they were from a car accident. They'd believed her. And you came from? Pierce's tone suggested he already knew the answer and was testing to see if she'd lie. Memorial Hospital in Phoenix. Emergency department, 3 years. It was a constructed identity, perfect in every detail. References checked out. Background clear. No red flags. Katie had been building this person since the moment her CO had called her into his office and asked if she wanted a temporary reassignment. She'd said yes without hesitation. She always said yes. That was the problem with being the kind of soldier who saved people. People kept finding ways to ask you to save them. Pierce nodded once, a dismissal more complete than any word could have been, and turned his attention to the other nurses at the station. Jackson, he said, his voice dropping a full octave from the tone he'd used with Katie. I want to review the medication orders from the night shift. There were inconsistencies in the morphine documentation. Jackson, a nurse with 15 years of experience, Katie had learned on her first day, straightened immediately. His jaw tightened. I followed protocol on all documented. I didn't ask for an explanation, Pierce said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. It wasn't raised, wasn't aggressive in any conventional sense. It was the kind of quiet that came from someone who'd never had to raise his voice because everyone around him immediately obeyed. I asked for the records. Bring them to my office. Now. Jackson moved, the entire station watching him with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to be next. Katie could read the dynamic instantly. It was the same in every hierarchy, whether it was a military unit or a hospital. One predator at the top. Everyone else jockeying for a position that didn't involve becoming the target. She'd seen it in Tikrit with junior officers trying to curry favor with company commanders. She was seeing it now in the ER with nurses calculating the safest way to exist. She bent back over her for trays, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Lay out the supplies. Check the dates. Verify the seal integrity. The kind of work that required just enough focus to appear engaged and not enough to warrant conversation. Around her, the ER continued its steady rhythm, monitors beeping, gurneys rolling, the constant susurrus of a place where time mattered in ways the outside world couldn't comprehend. A trauma alert came through the radio, 38-year-old male, motor vehicle collision, ETA 8 minutes. The whole station shifted like a school of fish sensing the approach of a larger predator. Katie noted the alert, filed it away, kept working. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding, in that first 5 minutes of watching Dr. Pierce work the room, that she wasn't just dealing with a fraud scheme. She was dealing with someone who'd learned that power could be wielded without consequence. Someone who'd never had anyone push back hard enough to make him hesitate. Someone who looked at other human beings and calculated their utility the way accountants calculated overhead costs. Katie had spent for years in combat zones learning to read the men who were willing to shoot through civilians to achieve their objectives. She recognized the type. And as she watched Pierce disappear into his office with Jackson's medication records, she understood something else. Whoever had called her into this hospital had known exactly what she was walking into. And they'd sent her anyway. The challenge coin was still in her locker, pressed against the folded flag. When she got home tonight, when her 8-year-old daughter asked her about her day, Katie would tell her stories about helping people, about making a difference, about being a nurse. What she wouldn't tell her was that sometimes helping people meant sitting quietly in a room with predators and calculating exactly how to take them down without blowing your cover or destroying the lives of the people depending on you to hold it together. She reached for another tray and kept working. Room for 12 smelled like antiseptic and fear, the kind of fear that comes when you're elderly and watching someone in a white coat speak about your veins like you're not in the room. Katie had been inserting the 4 for exactly 43 seconds when Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his presence shifting the air pressure like a storm front moving inland. The patient was Mrs. Chen, 74, tremoring, hands folded across her lap. Her daughter sat rigid in the bedside chair, already sensing the approaching storm. "Nurse Rodriguez," Pierce's voice cut through the room's quiet like a blade. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you're using an 18-gauge needle on a geriatric patient? Or did they not teach basic vascular assessment in whatever program you barely graduated from?" The words carried into the hallway. Katie heard a nurse's footsteps pause outside, then hurry onward. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on Mrs. Chen's arm, the needle poised at the patient's antecubital fossa. The daughter's face flushed, embarrassment blooming across her cheeks like watercolor bleeding through paper. "The patient has thick skin and significant scarring from chemotherapy," Katie said, her voice level, informational. "An 18-gauge ensures adequate flow for the contrast dye imaging scheduled in 40 minutes. The alternative is a failed stick and a second attempt." Pierce stepped closer, his breath coffee sour, his cologne thick enough to coat the back of her throat. "I'll decide what's adequate. Charity case. Redo it with a 20-gauge, and try not to turn her arm into a pincushion." Katie's jaw tightened. Just a single muscle contraction. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, cold, flat, the color of winter sky over a kill zone, and then she looked away and went back to work. She withdrew the needle with controlled precision, set it on the sterile field, and started again. Her hands moved like a surgeon's, like someone who had placed 4s in field hospitals under mortar fire with shrapnel falling like rain. The second insertion was flawless. The 20-gauge seated perfectly. Saline flushed clear. The 4 board held it steady. "There," Pierce said, his voice dripping satisfaction. He left the room the way he'd entered, like a predator that had marked its territory. Katie disposed of the equipment and checked Mrs. Chen's vital signs. 120/80. Stable. The daughter's hands were still trembling. "You did nothing wrong," Katie said quietly. "The imaging protocol requires adequate venous access. You'll be fine." Mrs. Chen nodded, but something in her face had shifted. The subtle erosion of trust that happens when a stranger in authority undermines someone in front of you, when silence becomes complicity. Katie walked to the break room at 14:22. She had 32 minutes before her next patient assessment. She sat at the small table with her meal tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water. She opened the apple container. 3 nurses sat at the far end of the break room. Martinez, older, 15 years at Seattle General. Holloway, the float nurse from ICU rotation. And Chen, no relation to her patient, a night shift RN who usually ignored hierarchical tension. They glanced at each other. The same look Katie had seen soldiers exchange before abandoning a position. The collective recognition that this was an active threat zone, and proximity was liability. Without a word, they stood. Without a word, they left the room. The door closed with a soft click. Katie sat alone with her turkey sandwich, looking at nothing, her breathing steady and controlled. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum. Somewhere in the distance, a ventilator wheezed. She was halfway through the apple when she made a decision. She would not eat. She would not show emotion. She would not validate Pierce's strategy by retreating or explaining herself. She would simply exist here, at this table, in this moment, as she had existed through 47 consecutive nights in Tikrit without sleep, as she had existed through a patrol ambush where the radio operator to her left had stopped existing entirely. She was still at the table when her shift ended. The next morning, Katie arrived at 6:58 for her 7 o'clock start. The staff bulletin board near the main ER desk displayed a formal write-up printed on hospital letterhead. Her name was there in the subject line. The date stamp read yesterday at 16:23. Failure to follow standard protocols regarding needle gauge selection during peripheral for insertion. Patient safety concern flagged. Remedial training required. Signed by Dr. Pierce, ER Director. The fabrication was so transparent that it should have been laughable. A single complaint based on a procedure sheet executed flawlessly, supported by a patient who remained stable, disputed by basic vascular access protocols that explicitly recommend larger gauges for patients with scarred tissue. The inconsistency would be obvious to any competent nurse reading it. Obvious to them. Not obvious to anyone who mattered. Katie read the write-up once, then turned away. 3 nurses stood near the medication dispensary. They'd been reading it too. When Katie looked at them, they looked away, not from fear, but from the specific shame of witnessing injustice they couldn't stop. Pierce watched from his office window, his silhouette framed by glass. His phone was already at his ear. He was smiling. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 13:17 when Katie was called to bed 7, the Army Ranger patient, the one she'd been placed here to monitor. His name was Morrison. Age 61. Admitted for experimental regenerative therapy on a torn rotator cuff, except the paperwork said something else. The paperwork said he was a candidate for end-of-life care transition. High-cost patient. Chronic pain management. Palliative care recommendation pending. The kind of patient whose early transfer to hospice could generate significant billing complexity. His oxygen saturation was 78 and falling. Katie was at the bedside in 4 strides. His neck veins were bulging. His trachea was deviated to the left. He was gasping for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung trapping air in the pleural space, compressing his heart, cutting off his ability to breathe. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. No time for setup, no time for sterile prep in the way protocol demanded. His blood pressure was bottom out, his heart was seconds away from stopping. She palpated the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks as if her hands had never forgotten these coordinates, as if her hands belonged to someone else, someone trained in a different world. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That beautiful, terrible hiss that meant the pressure was releasing, meant the lung could expand again, meant his body could remember how to breathe. His oxygen saturation started climbing. 82, 88. 94, his blood pressure rose like a ship breaking surface. His eyes opened, and he gasped grateful breaths of air. A young medic, can't have been more than 23, probably new to the rotation, froze mid-compression. He was staring at Katie's hands. His eyes widened in recognition like someone seeing a ghost. "I know that technique," he said quietly. "The angle, the landmark palpation, or the speed. You're the combat medic from the Tikrit firefight." Katie's eyes flashed a single warning. "Don't. Not here. Not now." But another nurse had heard him. A per diem RN named Gomez who worked 3 different hospitals and had a brain like a filing cabinet. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly. Katie ignored both of them and checked the 4 line that had been placed during the compression. Normal sinus rhythm. Stable. The patient was breathing on his own, color returning to his face. Within an hour, the recovery room was cleared except for Morrison and the monitoring equipment. Katie was documenting the procedure, needle decompression, 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, successful pneumothorax resolution, vital stable, when the door opened. Dr. Pierce filled the doorway. His jaw was clenched so tightly that Katie could see the muscle bunching at the hinge. His hands were fists. His eyes held the specific fury of someone who had just watched $40,000 evaporate. He pulled her into the corridor. "That patient was not coded for aggressive intervention," he said, his voice low, controlled, which made it worse than if he'd shouted. "You don't run advanced procedures without explicit authorization." Katie met his stare. Her voice came out like ice sheets forming over dark water. That patient was experiencing tension pneumothorax. That patient was dying. "I can fix that with a needle." The only code I follow is the one where people don't die on my watch." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard the sound of his phone being drawn from his pocket. She heard the soft click of the screen activating. She heard the rapid-fire tapping of fingers against glass, texts being composed, names being called in the digital dark, a network of leverage and obligation being activated like a circuit board lighting up. The trembling in his hands wasn't anger. It was restraint. It was the restraint of a man watching his careful structure of fraud and billing irregularities suddenly threatened by a single well-placed needle and the memory of a woman who might know exactly what she was looking for. Katie kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his presence behind her like a change in air pressure, like a storm system rotating into position, gathering velocity for impact. And somewhere in the architecture of Seattle General, in the careful network of board members and administrators and hospital accountants, the machinery of her destruction was already grinding into motion. She had saved a man's life. And in doing so, she had just made a very powerful enemy realize exactly what he had to lose. Pierce sat in his corner office at 4:02 p.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of hour when hospitals shift from daylight efficiency to evening skeleton crews. He picked up his phone with the deliberate precision of a man who knew exactly which strings to pull and how much pressure to apply. The contact was already in his phone, Chief Medical Officer Charles Bancroft, a man who had steered approximately $847,000 in surgical referrals Pierce's direction over the past 18 months. The phone rang twice. Bancroft answered with the confident brevity of someone accustomed to authority. "Charles, we have a problem." Pierce's voice carried the tone of a concerned colleague, not a desperate man. This was calculated. Desperation was a scent that Bancroft could smell through a telephone line, and Pierce wasn't there yet. Not by a long shot. He was tactical, methodical, the way a surgeon plans an incision. The new nurse on my ER rotation. Katie Rodriguez. Pierce let the name hang in the air like a blade. She's creating liability exposures. Protocol violations. Last week, and for insertion mishap in front of patient families. This week, she's overstepping her scope of practice in ways that could expose the hospital to malpractice claims. Bancroft made a non-committal sound. This was the dance. Pierce needed to provide just enough plausible concern to trigger institutional inertia. Hospitals, he had learned over 2 decades, operated on fear of litigation and regulatory exposure far more than on any genuine commitment to patient safety. "I've documented everything. The pattern is escalating." Pierce opened his desk drawer and withdrew a file, thick, intentionally bulging with paperwork designed to look damning. He hadn't actually accumulated much concrete evidence yet, but volume mattered. Volume looked like diligence. "I'm recommending suspension pending investigation." The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Bancroft spoke, his tone now measured and businesslike. "Send me the documentation. I'll have HR review it first thing tomorrow." After Bancroft hung up, Pierce leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had just executed a move in a much larger game. He had spent 23 years building these relationships, and they functioned like a network of pressure points. You didn't need to move all of them at once. You just needed to activate them in sequence. The next call came at 5:12 p.m. Pierce dialed the number for Mercy Memorial School of Nursing in Dallas, or rather, the number that appeared in Katie's employment file as her alma mater. What Bancroft didn't know, what Katie's file creator at the Pentagon didn't anticipate, was that Pierce had a contact at the school's administrative office who owed him a favor from a patient referral 5 years ago. The woman who answered was already primed. Pierce explained he was conducting a routine credential verification as part of a hospital peer review process. He asked about Katie Rodriguez's graduation status, her clinical performance ratings, the specifics of her degree conferral. The woman hesitated. Pierce could hear the shuffle of papers, the slight uncertainty of someone who hadn't been briefed on how to handle classified military intelligence operations. "I'm not finding a record of that graduate," she finally said. "Can you spell the name again?" Pierce smiled. He didn't need her to find anything. He just needed the gap. He just needed the fact that when he asked about Katie Rodriguez's nursing credentials, the answer was a void. A nothing. Absence was absence, and in employment law, absence was liability. After the call ended, Pierce placed 3 more, leaving messages with 2 other reference contacts listed on Katie's application. Each message was carefully worded, routine credential verification. Please call back at your earliest convenience regarding Katie Rodriguez. It's important. Each message planted a seed of confusion. Each seed would germinate into doubt. By 6:34 p.m., Pierce's phone rang. The number displayed came from an HR consulting firm in Austin, a woman named Diane Kellerman who specialized in building ironclad termination cases for hospitals and large employers. Pierce had used her twice before, and she had never disappointed. "I have a file for you," Pierce said. An employee with credential irregularities, documented protocol violations, and escalating scope of practice overreach. "I need the case built airtight." Kellerman's voice was clipped, professional, the voice of someone who had constructed dozens of termination architectures and understood that the strongest cases were built on paper trails, not truth. "What's your timeline?" "Fast. 48 hours, if possible. The employee is creating ongoing liability. I'll need documentation, witness statements, incident reports. Anything written. Anything dated." "I'm sending you the file tonight," Pierce said. "And I'm adding something else. She performed a medical procedure without a license this afternoon. I have multiple witnesses." The line went quiet. Then Kellerman's voice came back with a different tone, sharper, more energized, the way a predator's ears perk when it senses wounded prey. "That's felony exposure. That changes everything." When the line went dead, Pierce checked the time, 6:41 p.m. In less than 2 hours, he had activated his network. The chief medical officer was aware. Credential references had been contacted. A professional termination architect was in motion. And Katie Rodriguez had no idea that the walls were collapsing. But there was one more element he needed to control, the physical evidence. Pierce walked down the stairs to the basement storage room where the emergency equipment was restocked. The crash carts were arranged in neat rows, each one labeled with a date and inventory checklist. He found the one designated for Trauma Bay 3, the primary ER cart. With methodical precision, he removed the newer intubation equipment, the reliable stuff, the tubes with intact plastic, the equipment that actually worked. He replaced it with supplies from the hospital's back stock, inventory that had expired 18 months ago. Brittle plastic. Faulty seals. Equipment that would fail under the pressure of an actual emergency, equipment that would require a physician to recognize the problem and pivot to alternative strategies. Equipment that, if used in a code situation, could make the difference between a properly managed airway and a catastrophic failure. This was his cost-cutting measure, the one that padded profit margins. Expired supplies cost less. They were removed from active stock at lower expense. The difference, when multiplied across the hospital's equipment lifecycle, generated margin. Pierce had implemented this strategy across 6 different crash carts over the past 3 months, and not a single patient had needed emergency intubation that required those specific carts. Statistical luck was on his side. He was closing the cart door when his radio crackled with a code he recognized, unusual traffic from the cafeteria direction. A visitor choking. Unresponsive. Code activated. Pierce did not move toward the cafeteria. He walked back to his office and closed the door, where he could hear the chaos of emergency response filtered through the hospital's walls like distant thunder. He heard the announcement, the pages, the movement of staff. The room went dead silent in his consciousness, a moment of perfect clarity where he understood that probability had finally aligned against someone else. 7 minutes later, a nurse named Maria burst into his office, her face flushed, her voice breathless. There was a choking emergency in the cafeteria. Katie Rodriguez did a tracheotomy with a ballpoint pen. She saved the patient's life. People are calling her a hero. Pierce's face did not change. His hands did not tremble. He simply stood, his jaw tightening to the texture of polished stone, his eyes going flat and dark the way a predator's eyes go flat just before violence. The patient he had been using for cost-cutting experiments, discharged 2 days ago, billing completed, was irrelevant. But the fact that Katie Rodriguez had just performed advanced surgical intervention without authorization, in front of multiple witnesses, without a physician's order, in a situation where there was no protocol coverage, no standing medical authority, that was gold. That was everything. "Thank you for informing me," Pierce said, his voice steady and cold. "Summon her to my office. Now." When Katie appeared 5 minutes later in his doorway, still wearing her scrubs, her hand steady at her sides, Pierce rose behind his desk with the satisfaction of a man who had just closed a trap he'd spent hours constructing. "You just violated your scope of practice," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You performed a surgical procedure. Without a physician's order. Without authorization. I have 17 witnesses. You're suspended effective immediately, pending investigation for practicing medicine without a license. Security will escort you from the building. Your access badges are revoked. Do not contact any staff members. Do not return to the unit. You'll receive formal termination papers within 48 hours. Katie stood motionless in the doorway. Her expression did not change. Her breathing did not accelerate. She simply looked at Pierce with the flat, measuring gaze of someone examining a problem already solved, and said nothing. That silence was somehow worse than anger. That silence suggested she had seen this coming the way a chess player sees for moves ahead. But Pierce could not afford to consider what she might have anticipated. He had already executed his strategy. The network was activated. The case was being built. The termination was inevitable. She turned and walked away, and her badge clattered against the tile floor in her wake, a sound like a coin dropped into a well, echoing through the corridor long after she had disappeared. The needle went in. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The hiss of air escaping, a sound like a tire deflating, except this air was the difference between a heartbeat and flatline. Katie's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from 18 months in Tikrit taking over as the cardiac monitor's shriek stopped climbing and plateaued. Oxygen sat 88 and holding. The ranger in bed 7 was still dying, but slower now. Survivable slow. Around her, the ER noise resumed. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Someone called out lab values. A crash cart rattled past in the hallway. Normal sounds. The sounds of a hospital that didn't know what had just happened in this room. A medic across the trauma bay, young, maybe 26, with a Marine Corps tattoo half visible beneath his short sleeve, had frozen mid-compression when Katie made the needle insertion. His hand stopped moving. His eyes locked on hers, then on her hands, then back to her face. Recognition flickered across his features like a light switch flipping in a dark room. He was staring at something he thought he'd buried. Something he'd been told was impossible. "I know that technique," he said quietly. His hands resumed compressions, mechanical now, automatic. "I know those hands." He stopped. Swallowed. "You're the combat medic. From the Tikrit firefight. February 2019. You pulled 7 of us out of that kill zone." Katie didn't acknowledge him. She was checking the placement of the needle, monitoring the patient's response, calculating the next intervention. Her face remained a mask of clinical precision. But internally, something fractured. Not visibly. Not audibly. Just a hairline crack in the wall between her two lives, running exactly where she'd always known it would. The patient's eyes opened. Confused at first, then alert. Then terrified, that animal recognition of having stood at the threshold and stepped back. His lips moved. Katie leaned in, her ear near his mouth, her body shielding him from view. "You saved me," he whispered. Sinus rhythm, she said to the room, her voice pitched exactly as it always was. Professional. Detached. Get him to imaging. CT chest, abdomen, pelvis. Level 1 protocol. She turned away before he could say more. The medic was watching her still, his expression cycling through shock, understanding, something that looked like grief. Katie didn't make eye contact. She pulled off her gloves, the snap of latex echoing like a gunshot, and moved to the next bay, where a woman with acute MI was waiting. The next hour passed in a blur of protocol and procedure. Katie worked like a machine, efficient and reliable, exactly what Seattle General had hired. Exactly what Dr. Pierce had been working to destroy. At 1:36 p.m., when her shift should have had 6 more hours, her badge stopped working at the secured door. The electronic lock didn't buzz. Just a soft click, denial made mechanical. She tried again. Same result. Her phone buzzed. A termination letter, already printed and posted to the hospital system, effective immediately, suspended pending investigation for practicing medicine without a license. For performing a procedure outside her scope of practice. For endangering patient safety. The needle decompression that had saved a man's life had been reframed as a violation. The evidence was clean, the needle in the patient's chest, her hands holding it, the patient surviving when he should have coded. All of it documented. All of it weaponized. Katie left her stethoscope in her locker. She didn't take anything else. She simply walked out through the main entrance, past the sliding doors that opened for her with the same indifference they opened for everyone else, and into a San Antonio afternoon that was 94 degrees and felt like drowning in warm air. She drove home on autopilot. Her apartment was small, a rental that required no commitment, the kind of temporary space that soldiers and spies maintained as a precaution. A place you could leave in 4 hours if necessary. 2 bedrooms. One for her. One for Emma, her 8-year-old, who was supposed to be at after-school care until 5 o'clock. Katie sat at the kitchen table at 2:04 p.m., still wearing her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and latex gloves and the particular combination of fear and adrenaline that marked trauma resuscitation. She'd driven home in a daze, and only when she was already sitting had she realized she was crying. Not sobbing. Not breaking. Just the mechanical leaking of moisture from ice that had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, one body function among many that had to be managed and controlled. She was still sitting there, mascara tracking down her face in thin lines, when the key turned in the lock. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway at 3:22 p.m., backpack dragging behind her, her uniform rumpled from a day at St. Michael's Academy where children still believed the world made sense. Her daughter took 3 steps forward and stopped. Mommy. The word was small. Uncertain. Emma had learned to read her mother's silences, the way soldiers read wind direction. Why are you home early? Katie looked at her daughter. Really looked at her. This girl with her father's dark eyes and Katie's mouth, a mouth that hadn't smiled in 4 days because children feel these things, absorb them through the walls of their parents' careful composure. Emma was 8 years old. She deserved an answer. Katie had none that fit into words. We can have dinner together, Katie said finally, her voice steady in the way that had always terrified people more than any outburst. Just us. What do you want? Emma moved closer, studying her mother's face with the precision of a much older person. Are you sad? Yes. Because of Dr. Pierce. Katie's hands tightened on the table edge. She didn't ask how Emma knew. Children absorbed things. They saw the tension in their parents' shoulders, heard the careful neutrality in phone conversations, sensed when the person who was supposed to protect them had become the person who needed protecting. I did something that saved someone's life, Katie said slowly. And someone who doesn't like me found a way to say it was wrong. But it was right, Emma said. She was 5 feet away, but in that moment, she seemed to be studying Katie from very far off, the way people study soldiers they've only read about. You saved him. Yes. So why does it matter that he said it was wrong? Katie had no answer. In Tikrit, when she'd pulled that Marine out of a collapsed building, when she'd twisted a tourniquet around his femur with one hand while supporting his airway with the other, no one had disputed the rightness of the action. In the army, you saved lives because that was the mission. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't check protocols. You moved, and you trusted that the people who sent you would understand the difference between violation and salvation. But the army wasn't here. This was a civilian hospital in San Antonio, and the rules of combat didn't apply to operating rooms. They never did. They never would. Emma climbed into the chair beside her mother. She was small for 8, still had the round face of a much younger child, but her hands were steady when she reached over and took Katie's hand. They sat like that, in the kitchen that suddenly felt too large and too empty, while the afternoon light shifted toward evening and the folded flag on the top of the refrigerator caught the sun, the flag Katie had been carrying for 6 years, the one from the memorial service of the medic who died covering her extraction in Tikrit. The medic who'd made her promise to keep pulling people out, no matter the cost. Katie's phone buzzed. Her Pentagon handler. She didn't answer. Instead, she sat with her daughter, and they didn't talk about dinner. They didn't talk about anything. Sometimes the only thing soldiers and 8-year-olds have in common is the understanding that some silences are louder than any conversation. Outside, the city was moving forward. People were going to their jobs, returning to their homes, living the normal lives that Katie had been trying to construct as cover and had somehow, without meaning to, actually started living. That was the trap of deep cover. You started to forget what you were underneath. You started to believe your own legend. Until someone like the Marine medic looked at your hands and remembered. Until someone like Dr. Pierce decided your competence was dangerous. Until someone like your daughter asked a question you couldn't answer without breaking the most important rule of all, the rule that children needed to believe their parents knew what they were doing. Katie's scrubs were still damp with sweat. Her hand smelled like the patient's blood. She hadn't saved just one man today. She'd blown open her cover, triggered an investigation she couldn't defend herself in without revealing her actual assignment, and destroyed the primary reason her daughter had a roof over her head and food on the table. She had no idea that in exactly 23 hours, everything would change again. She had no idea about the unidentified ranger who was about to arrive in Seattle General's emergency department. She had no idea about the challenge coin that would fall from her pocket, about the general who would appear in the doorway, about the $47 million in fraud that her investigation had uncovered and that was about to bring down not just Dr. Pierce, but the entire structure of deceit he'd been building. For now, she just sat with her daughter in the growing dark, and she didn't let go of Emma's hand. The call came at 11:44 p.m. Mass casualty protocol. 10-car pileup on IR-37, heading to Seattle General. Katie was suspended, benched, boxed out, none of it mattered anymore. The hospital needed bodies. The hospital needed her. She drove through San Antonio rain with her jaw locked, water hammering the windshield like artillery, and she didn't think about Pierce or the board or her destroyed credibility. She thought about the ranger patient from Act 3, the one whose eyes still found hers sometimes in the hallway before security escorted her out. The one whose lungs she'd re-inflated. The one Pierce had marked for profitable death. The ER doors burst open at midnight. Katie stood at the threshold in jeans and a rain-soaked jacket, suspended badge clipped to her hip belt, not her scrubs. The charge nurse, Patricia, who'd stopped speaking to her 3 days ago, locked eyes with her for one breath. Then nodded. Protocol superseded everything. Katie moved into the controlled chaos of mass casualty, and her body remembered. 17 minutes until first arrival. The nurses scrambled. Katie didn't ask for permission. She pulled on scrubs that weren't hers, grabbed trauma shears from the crash cart, and moved to Trauma Bay 4 because that's where the first critical patient would land. Her hands were already steady. Her voice had already dropped an octave. The timid suspended nurse was gone. The ambulance arrived at 12:34 a.m. with a stretcher carrying an unidentified male, late 50s, unconscious, no wallet, no identification, just a Ranger Regiment ring on his left fourth finger, solid gold, worn smooth from decades. The paramedics' report came rapid, found him at mile marker 42, ejected from a sedan, GCS-3, unresponsive, we intubated in the field. Katie cut away his shirt with brutal efficiency, exposing a chest mapped with surgical scars and older shrapnel wounds. Chest trauma, significant. She reached for EKG leads, her movements precise as a surgical laser when the ranger's eyes flickered. Then opened. And locked directly on her face with the kind of shocked recognition that stops time. His lips moved. No sound. Then a whisper, rough as gravel, one word that made the entire trauma bay freeze: Reaper. Katie's hands didn't falter. The EKG lead still moved into place. But her breath changed. Deepened. The ranger's eyes stayed locked on hers, and she saw it then, the scar tissue around his right eye socket, the missing pinky finger on his left hand, the specific angle of his collarbone from a break that hadn't healed clean. Tikrit. November. Year not spoken aloud anymore. A kill zone in the Jolan district where she'd pulled 14 men out of fire and left her humanity somewhere in the rubble. Monitors up, one of the residents called. Sinus rhythm, BP 90/50 and climbing with fluids. Katie was still touching the ranger's shoulder. She released him, stepped back one pace, and that's when the Marine Corpsman, Thompson, name tape visible under his open collar, froze mid-compression of the 4. He was staring at Katie's left hand. Her palm was open, and in the fluorescent white of the trauma bay, her scars were visible. The specific pattern. The ones from Tikrit. The shrapnel from the IED that never quite healed clean. Thompson reached toward Katie's scrub pocket. Slowly. Respectfully. His hand emerged holding a challenge coin, tarnished silver with copper seeping through where the anodizing had worn away. He turned it over, reading the engraved edge aloud, his voice steady as a man announcing a name at a funeral, for extraordinary valor under fire, Captain Katie Rodriguez. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. 2 of the residents turned. The trauma nurse froze mid-medication setup. 1 second of absolute silence. Then Dr. Pierce's footsteps thundered through the corridor outside, his voice already rising. What is happening in here? I need Rodriguez off hospital property immediately. She's suspended. She's not cleared to be. He stopped. Stood in the doorway. Saw Katie. Saw the ranger. Saw Thompson holding the challenge coin with both hands like it was made of glass. Saw the moment his elaborate architecture of lies realized it was standing on sand. The ranger's eyes never left Katie. His voice came stronger now, oxygen improving his clarity. She pulled 15 of us out of a kill zone. His breathing was labored but determined. Medic and trigger puller both. Took shrapnel. Kept moving. Didn't stop until everyone was safe or accounted for. This is inappropriate, Pierce said, but his voice had lost its authority. It was a man speaking into an echo chamber. She has no credentials. She cannot be present during treatment. I'm calling security. Nobody moved. That's when the doors at the far end of Trauma Bay opened. Not the sliding ER doors. The security doors. The ones that led to administration. 2 uniformed officers entered first, but they weren't hospital security. The patches on their sleeves read Pentagon Police. Behind them came a woman in a dress uniform, 2 stars on her shoulder boards catching the fluorescent light like stars actually catching light, precise, undeniable, impossible to look away from. Brigadier General Sarah Halloway. 163rd Medical Command. Her bearing made the air pressure change. Her presence didn't request space. It took it. Pierce's face drained of all color. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. General Halloway crossed the trauma bay with 4 measured steps. She looked at the ranger. Then at Katie. Then at Pierce. Her hand came up in a crisp salute, fingers perfectly aligned at her temple, the kind of salute given to equals, to soldiers, to those who've bled for something larger than themselves. Katie returned it, muscle memory moving her arm with no instruction from her conscious mind. Captain Rodriguez, the general said, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, present, dangerous, utterly controlled. Your investigation recovered $47 million in fraudulent billing across 3 military medical contracts. Systematic upcoding. False DNR recommendations. Kickback arrangements with equipment suppliers. You obtained the evidence despite having your clearance revoked and your professional credibility destroyed. Pierce took one step backward. Then another. The outside HR investigator you brought in to terminate Captain Rodriguez is actually a military contract compliance officer, General Holloway continued, turning her eyes toward Pierce like turning a spotlight. Legally embedded in your hospital's HR department since August 14th. Every write-up you filed against her is now classified as obstruction of federal investigation. Your computer is currently being inventoried by agents who are examining your email correspondence regarding upcoding patients, your personal approval of the crash cart containing expired equipment that endangered lives, and your documented conversations with board members attempting to influence her termination. 2 federal agents moved past Pierce into the trauma bay. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. His presence had already become irrelevant. His power was translating into evidence in real time. Every call he'd made to his network had been documented. Every favor he'd called in was becoming conspiracy. The beautiful mechanism of his influence had inverted. Each connection was now a thread for prosecution to pull. The Ranger patient Captain Rodriguez saved 3 days ago, General Holloway said, will be interviewed regarding his conversation with you about his prognosis. He states you told him his condition was terminal when it was recoverable. He states you recommended hospice to his family while billing for aggressive intervention you never provided. 17 families of military patients have been contacted. Victim advocacy has already begun. Katie was still holding the EKG leads. The Ranger's hand reached up and gripped her wrist. Not urgently. Gently. Recognition. Acknowledgement. I remember. Pierce's voice came out as something between a whisper and a plea. I was following protocol. The patients were, the billing was standard in this region. I never? Your medical license suspension is immediate and permanent, General Holloway said. Your assets are under civil forfeiture proceedings. The Department of Defense is pursuing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and negligent endangerment of military personnel. You have the right to an attorney. The agents moved toward Pierce's position. He didn't resist. He'd already stopped being a person in the room. He'd become a process. A legal action. A cautionary tale. Katie watched him leave. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. When his footsteps faded down the corridor, the trauma bay exhaled like a single organism releasing breath it had been holding for months. The Ranger squeezed her wrist once more, then released her. General Holloway met her eyes. Welcome back, Captain, Holloway said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. 6 months later, Katie walked into a basement classroom at a community college outside San Antonio, the kind of place where fluorescent lights flickered like they were apologizing for existing. 12 students sat in plastic chairs. On the demonstration dummy's chest, Katie placed a folded flag, not the American flag, though that was folded inside it. This flag was smaller, black with a unit insignia, worn soft from being carried in a rucksack for 11 years. The flag from her teammate. The one who didn't come back. The one she carried to remember why she hunts men like Pierce. Dr. Pierce stood at the front of the room, teaching CPR basics for minimum wage, his medical license in the past tense, his career a closed case, his influence scattered like ash. He was demonstrating chest compression on the dummy when he looked up and saw Katie. His hands froze mid-motion. The students didn't understand why. They were just watching a suspended doctor teach them how to push on plastic. But Pierce understood. He understood exactly what the folded flag meant. He understood that Katie hadn't come to hurt him. Hurt him was professional. This was personal. This was witness. This was a reflection. Katie didn't say a word. She turned and walked out of the room, her daughter waiting in the hallway outside, backpack covered in military unit patches. Katie could now explain, 75th Ranger Regiment, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Joint Special Operations Command. Her daughter hummed as they walked toward the parking lot, rain starting to fall again, the kind of rain that followed Katie everywhere because water finds its level and so does the truth. "Mommy, why did you give away your special flag?" Emma asked, her small hand fitting perfectly into Katie's larger one. Katie knelt to her daughter's level, and for the first time in months, something behind her ribs unclenched. "Because some lessons cost everything to learn. And some people need to see what they destroyed." Emma considered this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who understands more than she says. "Are you still sad like you were at the kitchen table?" Katie smiled. "Real this time." "No, baby. I'm not sad anymore." As they drove away from the community college, rain drumming a rhythm on the roof, Katie's phone vibrated. A text from General Holloway, new contract irregularities flagged at Walter Reed. Interest. Katie glanced at her daughter humming in the backseat, thought of the Ranger patient now recovered and home with his family, remembered Pierce's hands freezing on the CPR dummy when recognition hit him. She typed back one word, send. Because power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. If you like this story, please subscribe to see more tales of people who were underestimated and the moments they proved everyone wrong. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been judged only to find out they were dead wrong about you? And hit that like button for Katie and everyone serving quietly in uniform. Thanks for listening.